The first letter arrived on a Tuesday in March, sealed in a cream envelope with the Oakwood Estates HOA logo embossed in gold. Miranda Chen had been expecting it for weeks. She'd purchased the house on Willow Drive 8 months ago, a charming 1970s colonial with mature oaks, a wraparound porch, and a kidney-shaped pool that needed serious work. The pool was her project, her passion, her escape from the deadening routine of managing a dental practice. She'd spent 2 weeks last summer clearing the debris, scrubbing the bottom, replacing the pump. The new pump was industrial grade, powerful enough to handle years of neglect. It hummed to life each morning at 5 a.m., ran for exactly 4 hours, then shut down automatically. It was efficient. It worked. Margaret Holloway, the HOA president, had other opinions. Pool pump noise complaint, the letter began in bold, official font. Several residents have reported excessive noise from the equipment located at 447 Willow Drive. The maintenance pump operates at decibel levels that violate Section 423 of the Oakwood Estates covenants, conditions, and restrictions. Please remedy this violation within 14 days or face a fine of $100 per day. Miranda had read it 3 times, certain she was missing something. The pump ran for 4 hours in the morning, early enough that most people were already awake or leaving for work. The noise was no louder than a car engine, maybe quieter. She'd tested it herself, standing at the property line. It was barely audible from her neighbor's deck. She'd called the HOA office. Margaret had answered personally, of course she had, her voice crisp and condescending through the phone. "The covenant is clear," Margaret said. "Noise from any mechanical equipment before 7 a.m. is prohibited." "It's 5 a.m., Miranda said carefully, already sensing the futility. "That's before most people wake up." "The rule doesn't specify early morning," Margaret replied. "It says before 7 a.m., which is, let me check my calendar, before 7 a.m. Miranda had wanted to scream. Instead, she'd taken a breath and explained that the pump was necessary to maintain the pool, that it was industry-standard equipment, that she'd paid a contractor $3,200 to install it correctly. None of this mattered. Margaret had already decided. The letter was just performance, the HOA president playing her role, enforcing rules the way she enforced everything, with aggressive precision and zero flexibility. "You have 14 days, Margaret had said and hung up. That had been 5 weeks ago. Miranda sat in her home office now, staring at the email from Margaret's assistant. A second notice. This one threatened legal action. The fine had accumulated to $1,400. Margaret was escalating. She'd tried everything. She'd moved the pump's operation to 7 a.m. sharp. Margaret claimed neighbors were still complaining, neighbors who Miranda had spoken to personally, who'd said the pump noise was not even a problem honestly. She'd installed acoustic padding around the pump housing. Margaret had sent a notice citing visual blight from the industrial gray casing. She'd called a lawyer. He'd laughed, a bitter, tired laugh. "You could spend $5,000 suing the HOA and lose," he'd said. "Or you could disable the pump, let your pool become a mosquito breeding ground and algae factory, and lose a different way. Welcome to HOA hell." The pool was failing. Without regular circulation, the water had turned cloudy. Algae bloomed in dark corners. A family of ducks had moved in and seemed to be thriving, at least. Miranda had started calling it Lake Pestilence. But something else was happening too. Margaret's obsession was growing. She'd started photographing the pump from different angles. She'd filed complaints with the county about dangerous equipment. She'd organized a petition, which had garnered exactly 3 signatures, all from people Miranda had never met. She'd even consulted with a noise engineer, a petty-looking man named Derek, who arrived with a decibel meter and declared the pump borderline excessive at 72 decibels. "Is that actually excessive?" Miranda had asked. "It's borderline," he'd said, which wasn't an answer. The whole thing had spiraled into obsession. Margaret had become a phantom presence, circling 447 Willow Drive like a predator, looking for violations. She'd photographed Miranda's landscaping, excessive mulch accumulation, fire hazard, complained about the color of Miranda's garden gate, not approved in the approved colors list, and had sent 3 separate notices about a bird feeder, non-approved decorative element in front setback. The bird feeder had pushed Miranda over the edge. She'd taken it down, but not before posting a scathing review of the HOA on Google, Nextdoor, and the community Facebook group. She'd named no names, but Margaret had known instantly it was her. The response had been swift and terrifying. a cease and desist letter claiming Miranda was engaged in defamatory conduct and harassment of a sitting HOA official. Now, staring at the newest email, Miranda realized she was trapped. Margaret had escalated beyond reason and into the realm of vendetta. The only way out was to submit completely, to disable the pool, to remove any possible point of contention, to make herself small and invisible in her own home. She'd scheduled the contractor to come Wednesday. He'd drain the pool and decommission the pump. It would cost $800. Margaret's victory would be complete. Miranda looked out her home office window at the kidney-shaped pool, glimmering in the afternoon sun. The ducks were napping near the shallow end, their heads tucked under their wings. She wondered if they knew their lake was about to disappear. At that moment, Margaret Holloway was in her immaculate kitchen, reviewing the latest photographs she'd taken of 447 Willow Drive. She had 3 laptop windows open, one with the HOA email system, one with the county noise ordinance code, and one with a spreadsheet tracking all of Miranda's violations over the past 5 months. Margaret had lived in Oakwood Estates for 17 years. She'd served on the HOA board for 12 of those years and had been president for the last 6. The neighborhood had been in decline when she took over: neglected landscaping, inconsistent house colors, properties that looked more like rental properties than family homes. She'd implemented standards. She'd enforced them. And it worked. Property values had increased 23% since she'd taken office. The neighborhood looked unified, maintained, respectable. Yes, there had been resistance. Yes, she'd had to pursue people like this Chen woman who thought they could do whatever they wanted just because they owned a house. But that was the job. HOA presidents were supposed to be tough. They were supposed to maintain standards. This Chen woman, though, she'd become personal. The defamatory review had hurt. Margaret had cried that night, actually cried, reading that someone thought she was a tyrant in a perfect house destroying people's lives. The words had lodged in her chest like shrapnel. But Margaret had a plan. She'd been researching the property. The house had been built in 1978, but the lot itself had been part of Oakwood Farm for over 100 years before the subdivision was developed in the 1960s. There might be violations in the original survey, issues with the property line, something that could establish Miranda as a long-term offender. Margaret had even contacted the county assessor, looking for ammunition. What she'd discovered was more interesting than violations. In the county records, there was a curious note. 1823 land grant includes underground structure, purpose unknown, likely historical. Recommend archaeological survey before any major excavation. Margaret had filed that information away, assuming it was nothing. Old properties had old records. Most of them were meaningless bureaucratic notations. She had no idea that her obsessive documentation, her compulsive need to win, had set something in motion. She had no idea that her victory, forcing Miranda to drain the pool, to shut down the pump, to remove the very equipment that had kept that pool functional, was about to crack open a 200-year-old secret buried beneath Miranda's backyard. Neither of them knew what was coming. Danny Reeves had been draining pools for 23 years. He drained them in Florida, California, Arizona, and now suburban Pennsylvania. He drained pools in thunderstorms in 110-degree heat in January sleet. He developed a philosophical approach to the work: show up on time, do it right, don't complain. Pools were just water. Water went away. Simple. The job at 447 Willow Drive was scheduled for Wednesday morning at 8 a.m. Danny arrived with his truck, a Ford F-250 with pump equipment in the back, and found Miranda Chen sitting on her porch with coffee, looking like she'd aged 5 years since the photos on her next-door profile. "It's a nice pool," Danny said, not unkindly, as he set up his equipment. "It was," Miranda said. "Now it's evidence of tyranny." Danny didn't ask for details. He'd learned over the years that drained pools came with backstories, and most of those stories were about people who wanted to control other people. He'd heard enough. The pump he was there to decommission was actually pretty nice. A Hayward variable speed pump, relatively new, the kind that could run for 10 more years without issue. Danny felt a small twinge of waste as he looked at it, but waste was part of the job too. He connected the drainage hose and got started. The water would take about 6 hours to pump out. While it ran, he could get started on the pump removal. He positioned his equipment, grabbed his tools, and began disconnecting the pump from the pool's circulation system. It was while he was working on the main drain valve that he noticed something odd. The drain seemed deeper than it should be. Standard residential pools had drains about 8 feet below the surface. Danny's hand measurements suggested this one went deeper, maybe another foot or so. He could feel the extra length in the pipe as he worked the coupling loose. "Your drain is pretty deep," he called to Miranda, who was still on the porch. "I don't know anything about that," she said. "The previous owner had it installed." Danny shrugged and continued. As the water level dropped and exposed more of the pool floor, he noticed something else. Unusual mortar lines in the concrete floor, geometric patterns that didn't look like standard pool construction. They looked almost intentional, like they were marking something beneath the surface. By hour 4, the pool was half drained. Danny could see the bottom clearly now. The floor wasn't smooth like most modern pools. There were ridges, slight elevation changes, and those mortar lines formed a distinct pattern, almost like a square, maybe 8 feet by 8 feet, right in the center of the pool. Danny had a feeling he should stop what he was doing. He called Miranda over. "Come look at this," he said. Miranda walked to the edge and peered down into the draining pool. The exposed floor was covered in algae and slime, but even through the murk, she could see what Danny meant. The pattern was deliberate. It looked like someone had used the concrete floor to mark something. "That's weird," she said. "Yeah," Danny agreed. "I'm going to pull the pump and leave the rest of the draining for now. I think you should have someone look at this before we do any more." "Look at what?" Miranda asked. "It's probably just old construction markers or something." But Danny was already on his phone, calling his manager. By Thursday morning, Miranda's house was filled with people. A structural engineer had arrived first, recommended by Danny. His name was Kevin, and he'd taken one look at the marked square in the pool floor and immediately called the county archaeologist. The archaeologist, a sharp-eyed woman named Dr. Lisa Patel, had arrived within 2 hours. Dr. Patel had stepped into the drained pool, with professional excitement barely contained in her expression. "This is incredible," she'd said, kneeling beside the marked square. "These are definitely construction markers, deliberate, and look at the age of the concrete. This is much older than the pool itself." "What does that mean?" Miranda asked. "It means," Dr. Patel said, running her fingers across the mortar, "that whoever built this pool in the 1970s poured concrete over something that was already here, something they wanted to hide or protect." Within 6 hours, Dr. Patel had obtained an emergency excavation permit from the county. By Friday morning, she had a team on site with ground-penetrating radar, archaeological tools, and documentation equipment. They'd cut into the pool floor and discovered exactly what the old markers suggested, an entrance to something underneath. By Saturday, the entrance had been cleared. It was a stone staircase descending into darkness. The stones were hand-cut, fitted together without mortar, the technique consistent with early to mid-19th century masonry. Dr. Patel was almost vibrating with excitement. "This is extraordinary," she kept saying. "A chamber of this age, this intact, undisturbed for probably 50 years, the artifacts inside could be completely preserved." They descended carefully, documenting every step. The staircase led to a chamber approximately 15 feet underground, with a low stone ceiling and walls that seemed to be natural rock formation, reinforced with hand-cut stone. The air was cool and surprisingly dry. What they found inside stopped Dr. Patel mid-breath. It was a room full of history. Wooden crates, carefully stacked, some still bearing hand-painted labels. A desk made of dark wood with brass fixtures. Oil lamps unbroken, books, rows of them leather-bound, their spines visible even in the archaeological lights. And on the far wall, a collection of metal boxes, each one sealed and labeled. "Oh my God," Dr. Patel whispered. "This is an abolitionist safe house." The realization spread like electricity through the team. The dates on some of the crates, 1847, 1851, 1858, aligned with the height of the Underground Railroad. The location made sense. A property on the edge of town with a farmhouse that could be used as a way station, a hidden chamber where escaped enslaved people could hide, rest, be fed, and then moved along the network. One of the archaeologists carefully opened a sealed wooden crate. Inside, wrapped in aged cloth, were shoes. Dozens of pairs. Different sizes, all worn, all carefully preserved for a reason. They were labeled on the soles with names and dates. "These were for the passengers," someone said quietly. "For people traveling barefoot or in inadequate clothing." Another crate held clothing, undergarments, socks, wraps, all hand-sewn, all carefully mended and preserved. A third held what appeared to be medical supplies, bottles of herbs, bandages, implements for basic first aid. In one of the metal boxes, they found documents, letters, records, a ledger meticulously kept with entries listing safe houses, routes, names, and dates. The handwriting suggested it had been maintained by a single person over many years, someone educated, someone who understood the importance of documentation. The final discovery came from a locked wooden chest beneath the desk. Dr. Patel opened it carefully, and inside lay what appeared to be personal effects, a daguerreotype photograph of a woman, stern and determined, wearing early 19th century clothing, a wedding ring, a handwritten journal, the leather binding cracked with age but the pages still intact. By Monday, the story had reached the local news. By Tuesday, it was national. By Wednesday, the chamber had been professionally excavated, documented, and carefully secured. The artifacts were being transferred to the State Historical Museum for preservation and study. The name of the woman in the photograph, Sarah Blackwood, had been found in the ledger and in multiple entries in the journal. Sarah Blackwood had operated this safe house from 1823 until her death in 1865. She had records of assisting over 400 people on their journey to freedom. She had documented routes, stations, contacts. She had preserved the evidence of the very history that had tried to erase itself. The house at 447 Willow Drive had become a historical landmark overnight. And Miranda Chen, the woman Margaret Holloway had been bullying into submission, now lived in a house that contained one of the most significant Underground Railroad documents ever discovered. Margaret Holloway learned about the discovery through a text from her daughter, sent without context. A link to a national news article with the headline, Historic Abolitionist SAFEHOUSE DISCOVRED in Pennsylvania. Over 400 lives AIDED. The article included a photograph of the stone chamber, the neatly stacked crates, and a caption identifying the homeowner, Miranda Chen. Margaret read it 3 times, her brain unable to reconcile the words she was seeing with the narrative she'd constructed over the past 5 months. That woman. That annoying woman with the pool pump. She'd been sitting on top of a 200-year-old historical treasure, and Margaret had been too busy demanding she remove it to even consider asking why the property had that unusual county notation. She clicked through to the museum's statement. The Underground Railroad artifacts discovered at the Blackwood House represent one of the most complete and well-documented collections of materials from a single safe house anywhere in the United States. The comprehensive records and preserved materials, particularly the journal of Sarah Blackwood and the documented routes, offer unprecedented insight into the network of individuals and families who risked everything to facilitate freedom. The discovery would not have been possible without the current homeowners' cooperation in allowing the excavation. Miranda's cooperation. Miranda had been cooperative. Miranda had let archaeologists tear up her pool, had allowed her property to be invaded by researchers and historians, and now the general public. She'd done it without reservation or complaint. Margaret felt something inside her chest, a pressure building, pushing outward. It felt like shame, but it looked like fear. She decided to call Miranda. It took her 20 minutes to work up the courage. Miranda answered on the 3rd ring. In the background, Margaret could hear voices, activity, what sounded like television or news broadcasts. "Mrs. Holloway," Miranda said. Her voice was calm, which somehow made it worse. "I saw the news," Margaret said. "About the chamber, that's remarkable." Silence. Margaret pushed forward. "I wanted to say, I didn't realize." Margaret's words were crumbling. She tried again. "I'm sorry for the enforcement actions, for the complaints. I didn't know." "You didn't know what?" Miranda asked. "That my property had historical significance, or that you shouldn't treat people the way you've been treating me." The question hit hard because the answer was both, and Margaret couldn't say either one without facing herself. "I was doing my job," Margaret said, and immediately hated how defensive it sounded. "Your job was to bully someone who had done nothing wrong," Miranda said. "Or was it to listen when someone tried to explain their situation? Because I tried that. Multiple times, you chose not to listen." Margaret wanted to cry. Instead, she said, "What can I do to make this right?" "You can resign," Miranda said calmly and finally. You can write a letter to the community acknowledging that your enforcement has been disproportionate and that you're stepping down, and you can stop. You can stop treating people like violations instead of neighbors. Margaret sat with this. She'd been president of the HOA for 6 years. She'd made significant improvements. She'd also made someone's life miserable for having a pool pump. "Okay," Margaret said, "I'll do that." She didn't ask Miranda if she accepted the apology. There was no acceptance offered and none asked for, just the simple acknowledgement of the wrong and the beginning of consequences. By Thursday, Margaret's resignation letter had been published in the community newsletter and posted on the HOA website. In it, she acknowledged her disproportionate enforcement and her willingness to step down. She also announced a new HOA policy. Going forward, enforcement actions will be pursued only when they represent genuine violations that pose safety concerns or constitute genuine nuisances affecting multiple residents. Subjective quality of life complaints will no longer warrant enforcement action. It was half apology, half policy shift. The board had accepted her resignation and appointed a new president, Roger Mills, a retired engineer who'd never served on the board before and wanted to keep it that way. But Margaret wasn't done yet. That weekend, she drove to the Historical Museum. She requested a meeting with Dr. Patel, who was overseeing the preservation and cataloging of the Blackwood artifacts. Dr. Patel received her in a climate-controlled archive room, surrounded by carefully preserved 19th-century materials. "I live in the neighborhood," Margaret said. "I'm the one who—" "Well, I was difficult about the discovery. I want to help. I want to support the documentation and preservation of these materials." Dr. Patel studied her for a moment, then smiled slightly. "You can help," she said. "The community documentation is extensive, but there are gaps. We're looking for historical records about the property itself, county deeds, descriptions, anything that might shed light on who lived there before Sarah Blackwood or after. Family records, correspondence, anything local." "I can do that," Margaret said. "I can research it. I have access to the county records, and I know people who have lived in the area for decades." And so Margaret found herself doing the thing she'd never done as HOA president: listening, asking questions, allowing for the possibility that there was more to a story than her initial perception of it. She began interviewing longtime residents of Oakwood Estates, asking about the property's history. She discovered that the house had been in the same family, descendants of Sarah Blackwood, until 1971, when it was sold to a developer. The developer's son, it turned out, was still alive and living in a retirement community 40 miles away. Margaret visited him. His name was Robert, and he was 93 years old, sharp as a tack, with a memory that reached back to his childhood on that property. "My father bought it for the land," Robert told her over tea in his assisted living facility. "The original house was falling apart, so he tore it down and rebuilt in the 1970s style. But my mother made him keep the pool area away from where the original foundation was. She said it was good luck. Apparently she was right, because nobody ever wanted to build there. The realtor in the 1980s complained about the spot constantly, said it was a waste of premium backyard space." "Did your mother know," Margaret asked, "about the chamber?" "My father never told her, but she seemed to know," Robert said. "My mother's maiden name was Blackwood, distant relation, I think. Family story said there was property with history and she didn't want it disturbed." Margaret recorded the interview, documented his contact information, and passed all of it to Dr. Patel. It filled in gaps in the historical record. It added context and meaning to the discovery. More importantly, it gave Margaret something she hadn't had in years: a sense of purpose beyond enforcing rules. She'd spent 6 years telling people what not to do. Now she was helping preserve a legacy of people who had risked everything to help others. She attended the museum's opening of the Blackwood exhibition in early June. It was standing room only. High school groups came to see it. History professors brought their students. People came from across the country. And at the opening, Dr. Patel gave a special acknowledgement. "We want to thank the community members who made this discovery possible," Dr. Patel said. From Danny Reeves, who noticed something unusual about a pool drain, to Dr. Kevin Martinez, who recommended an archaeological survey, to Margaret Holloway, who spent months researching the property's history after the initial discovery to add context and depth to our understanding. Margaret sat in the audience, her face flushed. She'd expected to be vilified or at least ignored. Instead, she'd been acknowledged alongside people who'd made genuine contributions. After the ceremony, Miranda found her in the crowd. "Dr. Patel told me you did the research on Robert," Miranda said. "The family connection. She said it was instrumental in validating some of the documents." Margaret nodded. "I wanted to help after everything." Miranda studied her for a moment and Margaret braced for judgment. Instead, Miranda said, "Come see the house sometime. It's remarkable. They've preserved the chamber, but they've also created an educational space. I think you'd appreciate it, for historical reasons." It was not forgiveness, but it was a door opening. "I'd like that," Margaret said. 3 months after the chamber's discovery, Miranda stood in her backyard watching workers from the Historical Preservation Society carefully begin the process of restoring the pool area. The chamber itself had been professionally sealed and would remain accessible only to researchers and school groups. But the pool would be restored to its original state, or something close to it, with educational signage and a small pavilion for visitors. The constant flow of people through her yard had become a strange new normal. School buses pulled up regularly. Tourists drove by slowly, craning their necks. Reporters still called occasionally, though the fever had cooled since the initial discovery. What hadn't cooled was the internet's appetite for the story. Miranda had become, somewhat accidentally, the face of the historical discovery. She'd given interviews because Dr. Patel asked her to contextualize how the chamber had been found. But the narrative had evolved beyond her control. She'd become a hero in some retellings, the brave homeowner who'd sacrificed her pool for history. In others, she was a convenient symbol of contemporary racial awareness, a white woman helping preserve the legacy of black resistance. She'd become a story people told about themselves. What she'd become very deliberately not was a person with her own life, her own struggles, her own simple desire to have a pool without making a national statement about it. She was sitting on her porch, trying to do some work. She'd had to reduce her dental practice hours because the house had become essentially a public building, when Danny Reeves pulled up in his truck. "Thought you might want to know," Danny said, approaching without preamble. "I've had 3 other clients call me asking if their pools might have historical chambers underneath them. One of them is now convinced there's something archaeological under her property because there's a slight elevation change in the pool floor." Miranda laughed despite herself. "What did you tell them?" "That they're being paranoid," Danny said. "But I got thinking, you ever think about how your life was before?" "I think about it constantly," Miranda admitted. "Sometimes I miss being nobody." "You're not nobody," Danny said. "But you also didn't volunteer for this. That HOA president, she forced you into a corner that made you have to drain the pool. That's what revealed everything. But she didn't do you a favor, she just broke something." Miranda hadn't thought about it that way, as a breaking rather than a discovery. But Danny was right. The pool pump had been functioning. The chamber had been sealed and protected. Nothing about the current state of her life was actually better, except that it was historically significant. And significance, Miranda was learning, was a poor substitute for peace. "What would you do," she asked Danny, "if it was you?" "I'd be honest about it," Danny said. "I'd stop pretending this was good and I'd tell people what it actually was, an accident. A mistake by someone who had too much power and not enough kindness. The discovery is valuable, but your life got broken to make it happen. Both things can be true." Danny left, but his words stayed with her. That evening, Miranda drafted an email to Dr. Patel. In it, she explained that while she was deeply grateful for the historical significance of the discovery, she needed to step back from her public role. She couldn't continue giving interviews or serving as a public figure for the discovery. She would cooperate with educational programming and research, but she needed her home back. She needed it to be a home, not a monument. Dr. Patel called her within an hour. "I understand," Dr. Patel said, "and I'm sorry. We should have anticipated the impact on your life. The historical community can be enthusiastic. We get so focused on what we're preserving that we sometimes don't consider the cost to the people in the present." "I appreciate you understanding," Miranda said. I want my life back." "You should have it," Dr. Patel said. "The chamber is sealed and will be managed by the museum from here on out. Visitors will go through a separate entrance, not through your property. We can limit access, make it manageable. You won't have school buses in your driveway every day." The relief was immediate. But something else happened too. Miranda started receiving letters, dozens of them, some from historians thanking her for her role in the discovery, some from descendants of people who'd escaped through the Underground Railroad who'd found names in the ledger that connected to their family histories, some from young people writing school essays about the importance of the discovery. One letter came from a woman named James Richardson, who wrote, "I found my great-great-grandmother's name in Sarah Blackwood's ledger. She traveled north from Virginia in 1851, and her journey went through your property. Because of what was found there, my family now knows her name and her story. For 150 years, she was just that relative nobody talked about. Now she's Sarah Miller, age 28, traveling with 2 children. Now she's real. I wanted to thank you for whatever you did to make it possible for us to know her." Miranda cried reading that letter, not because she felt like a hero, but because she understood, finally, what the discovery had actually meant. Not to her. Her own life was still disrupted, still navigating the complicated territory of being defined by an accident, but to people who'd been written out of history, who'd been reduced to absences and silences. She didn't suddenly feel like everything was worth it. The headaches remained. The constant intrusions remained. The loss of privacy remained, but the suffering had context now. It wasn't meaningless. It was painful and complicated, but not meaningless. She wrote back to James Richardson and asked her to share details about her great-great-grandmother. She wanted to know more than just a name. In her response, James sent a photograph, a daguerreotype carefully preserved of a woman with direct eyes and a slight smile. "Sarah Miller," the back read in faded ink, 1823-1901. Miranda put the photograph in a frame and placed it on her mantelpiece. Margaret Holloway sat in her living room, the same living room where she'd spent 6 years making decisions that affected an entire community, and allowed herself to feel the full weight of what she'd done. It wasn't an epiphany. There was no single moment of clarity. Instead, it was the accumulation of small interactions, quiet corrections, and the slow realization that the person she'd become was not someone she wanted to be. She'd called at least 15 people in the weeks after her resignation, residents she'd issued violations to, people she'd intimidated or threatened or simply worn down with bureaucratic persistence. She'd apologized to them, in person when possible, by phone when necessary. Some had been gracious. A woman named Helen, whose garden decorations had violated the approved materials list, had actually laughed. "I knew you'd figure it out eventually," Helen said. "I just didn't think it would take a 200-year-old chamber." Others had been less forgiving. A man named David, whose teenage son had been required to paint over a mural on their garage that violated color guidelines, told her flatly, "You can't give me back those hours my son spent on that wall, or the way he stopped wanting to do art after you made him erase it. That's your legacy." That one had stayed with her. It still did. She'd also realized something uncomfortable. She'd been using the HOA rules as a substitute for actual connection. She'd been so focused on maintaining standards that she'd never actually had a conversation with most of her neighbors. They weren't people to her. They were violations waiting to happen. Margaret decided to do something radical for someone like her. She started asking questions she didn't already know the answers to. She invited Helen over for coffee and asked her about the garden. Helen showed her photographs, not of the approved decorations, but of the full garden before Margaret had demanded the unapproved elements be removed. It had been beautiful, chaotic but beautiful, utterly unlike anything in Margaret's own aesthetic. She visited David and asked him about the mural. His son, now 16, had a portfolio of digital art that was extraordinary, complex, technically proficient, deeply felt. The mural had been a part of his development as an artist. "He's still creating," David said, "but he's more careful now, less willing to take risks. You taught him to make himself small. I hope you're satisfied." Margaret wasn't satisfied. She was horrified. She began attending community events she'd previously avoided, the HOA meetings where she no longer held authority, neighborhood parties, school functions. She listened more than she spoke. She asked people about their lives without bringing up violations or enforcement concerns. It was uncomfortable. She was not good at it, but she kept practicing. Then in late July, she received a letter from the county. It was written on official stationery, but the content was personal. It was from David Hutchins, the county assessor. "I served with you on the HOA board for 3 years," David wrote. I saw your transformation from a person who cared about community to a person who cared about rules more than people. I also saw something else recently. I've been working with the Historical Society on documenting the Blackwood property. Dr. Patel told me you did the research on the family connections. She said it was thorough and insightful. That's the Margaret I remember. I wanted you to know that I see you trying to change. The letter was brief, but it unlocked something in Margaret. She realized that redemption wasn't about performing penance. It was about actually becoming a different person, slowly, imperfectly, through thousands of small choices to listen instead of dictate, to connect instead of control. She called David Hutchins and asked if she could volunteer with the historical preservation work. "What's your motivation?" David asked, not unkindly. "I want to contribute to something that matters," Margaret said, "and I want to stop being defined by the harm I've caused." "That's honest," David said. "Okay, we need help organizing the archival materials. Specifically, we need someone with organizational skills and attention to detail to help catalog all of the documents we're still processing." For the next 3 months, Margaret spent 15 hours a week at the Historical Society, surrounded by 19th century materials. She organized letters, cataloged documents, and learned the detailed history of what Sarah Blackwood had actually been. Not a heroic abstraction, but a woman making impossible choices, sometimes making them wrong, always trying. She discovered letters between Sarah and her husband, Thomas, that revealed their marriage had been strained by his fear. Thomas had been terrified of being discovered, of losing everything. Sarah had been driven by conviction. They'd loved each other and disagreed profoundly about the risks they were taking. Margaret found herself relating to Thomas's fear, even as she recognized the cowardice in it. She'd been driven by fear too, fear of chaos, fear of disorder, fear that if she didn't maintain control, everything would collapse. She'd built a system of rules and used it as armor against that fear. But the rules had become more important than the people, and in serving the rules, she'd harmed people who'd done nothing wrong. In September, the Historical Society hosted an evening specifically focused on the personal stories from the chamber, not the artifacts, but the human narratives embedded in the documents. Margaret attended. So did Miranda. They ended up standing together during the reception afterward, looking at a display that featured Sarah Blackwood's wedding ring and a letter written by Thomas on the day she died. "She was doing something impossible," Miranda said. "And she did it for decades, and she kept meticulous records knowing they might never be found." "She kept them because she needed to know it mattered," Margaret said. "That what she was doing was real and counted, even if nobody ever saw the evidence." Miranda looked at her, really looked at her, and Margaret saw something in her expression shift. Not forgiveness, maybe, but recognition. Recognition that Margaret was trying to become someone different. "I received a letter from a woman named James Richardson," Miranda said. "Her great-great-grandmother traveled through Sarah Blackwood's safe house. The letter was beautiful. It helped me understand why this mattered, why my inconvenience was worth it." "I'm glad," Margaret said, and meant it. "I'm still angry at you," Miranda said, "for what you did, for what you took from me. But I'm glad you're doing this work, because if something good is going to come from that situation, it should come from you too." Margaret nodded. She didn't ask for absolution or forgiveness. She understood that those weren't Miranda's to give. She'd earned her consequences, and they would be ongoing. The best she could do was ensure they led somewhere meaningful. 1 year after the discovery, the restoration was complete. The chamber had been professionally preserved and was now accessible only through a separate entrance, a small stone building on the property designed to look historically appropriate. Visitors could descend into the chamber, see the artifacts, or high-quality replicas in some cases, and read Sarah Blackwood's words and records. The pool area had been partially restored. The kidney-shaped pool remained unfilled but preserved, a physical reminder of the layers of history stacked beneath every piece of ground. Informational signs explained what had been found, how it was discovered, and why it mattered. Miranda had returned to her normal rhythm. The initial media frenzy had subsided. Tour buses no longer pulled into her driveway. She'd increased her dental practice hours back to normal. She'd also become a member of the Historical Society Board, helping to ensure that the Blackwood legacy was managed with the respect it deserved. She'd filled the pool. It was a simple decision, made on a morning in September when the weather had turned warm again. She'd called Danny Reeves back, and he'd restarted the pump, Not the fancy industrial model, but a standard residential pump that ran quietly. Water had begun to flow, slowly refilling the kidney-shaped depression that had held secrets for over 100 years. She'd watched it fill day by day, until the surface was clear and calm and ready for swimming. The first time she dove in, the water was shockingly cold, shockingly alive. She'd swum for an hour, alone, enjoying the simple sensation of her body moving through the water, unobserved, unmarked. Just her and the pool and the ordinary pleasure of cooling off on a warm day. That evening, Margaret had knocked on her door. "I heard you filled the pool," Margaret said without preamble. "I did," Miranda confirmed. "I wanted to know, does it bother you, having the chamber underneath?" Miranda considered the question seriously. "No," she said finally. "It's kind of beautiful, actually. Sarah Blackwood kept that chamber secret for a reason. She wanted to protect it, preserve it, make it sacred in its own way. The pool above it isn't disrespectful, it's just a pool. And underneath it, there's still history, still evidence, still all those people's names and stories." Margaret nodded. "I think about her a lot," she said. "Sarah Blackwood, the risks she took." "What about them?" Miranda asked. "I think about how she did it despite being afraid, despite the costs. She didn't require recognition or gratitude. She just kept doing the work." Miranda understood what Margaret was saying. She was describing her own journey, implicitly. She was trying to become someone who contributed without requiring acknowledgement, who served without controlling, who stayed committed to something meaningful even when it was uncomfortable. It was working, too. The Historical Society was thriving. Margaret had helped coordinate a traveling exhibition. She'd written a scholarly paper on the Underground Railroad network in Pennsylvania, working with Dr. Patel. She'd become someone useful. "It's not the same," Margaret said, and Miranda understood that, too. She was acknowledging that her contribution would never equal what she'd taken from Miranda. She was accepting the permanent imbalance, the permanent consequence. "No," Miranda agreed. "But you're trying, and I think Sarah would respect that, trying despite the fear, despite knowing it's not enough." They stood in the gathering dusk, looking at the pool, hearing the pump running quietly, maintaining the water, keeping the system alive. "I go to the chamber sometimes," Margaret said, "to sit. Just to sit with what Sarah did, what she risked, what she built. It helps me put things in perspective." "That's good," Miranda said. "I'm sorry," Margaret said again, though they both knew this wasn't the first time she'd said it and wouldn't be the last. "For all of it." "I know," Miranda said. There was no forgiveness offered, but there was acceptance. Acceptance that harm had occurred, that consequences mattered, that redemption was possible but never complete. Acceptance that the world contained multitudes, people who hurt others and people who hurt, people who tried to change, and people learning to live with the permanent changes they couldn't undo. Margaret left as the sun finished setting. Miranda stood alone in her backyard, listening to the pump run, watching the water ripple slightly in the evening breeze. Below the water in the darkness, history remained. Sarah Blackwood's sealed chamber, preserved and protected, telling its stories to anyone willing to descend and listen. Above it, ordinary life continued. Miranda's pool, her home, her life. That night, Miranda pulled out her laptop and began writing a comprehensive history of the property, not for publication, but for the record. She documented what she knew, what the Historical Society had found, what the family connections revealed. She interviewed Danny Reeves, asking him to recall every detail of that first discovery. She compiled photographs, articles, letters. When it was finished, she printed it, had it professionally bound, and donated it to the Historical Society. "For people who come after," she wrote in the introduction. "For anyone trying to understand how a pool pump led to history, and how sometimes the most important discoveries come through the most ordinary failures." Dr. Patel called her when she received the donation. "This is incredible," Dr. Patel said. "This is exactly the kind of primary source documentation that will help researchers understand not just what we found, but how we found it. How the discovery happened as a result of circumstance and community. This is valuable." "It's just the truth," Miranda said. "It's worth writing down." In the final entry of her documentation, Miranda included a note. "The discovery of Sarah Blackwood's chamber beneath my pool was not a blessing. It was a consequence of being bullied until I had no choice but to drain the pool, a consequence of someone else's obsessive need to win, but consequences can carry meaning. And Sarah Blackwood's chamber, sealed and protected for 150 years, carries meaning. It tells us that people have always been willing to risk everything for freedom. That matters. Even if it came at the cost of my privacy and my peace. Maybe especially then. Maybe the discovery means more because it cost something to find it. The Blackwood House historical site had become one of the region's most important educational destinations. Over 20,000 visitors had descended into the chamber in the first 2 years. Researchers from universities across the country had published papers based on the archives. A documentary was in development. Sarah Blackwood's journal had been published as a critical edition, annotated by historians with an introduction by Dr. Patel. It had won a regional history award. Books were being written. Her story was being told. Margaret Holloway had stepped back from her public work with the Historical Society, but she'd kept volunteering, quietly, without fanfare. She'd also founded a foundation specifically dedicated to supporting community members who'd experienced HOA overreach. She'd worked with lawyers to help people challenge disproportionate enforcement actions. It was practical work, unglamorous but necessary. She still lived in Oakwood Estates. She still served on community committees, but differently now. She listened more. She trusted other people's expertise. She was careful with power. Miranda had become a docent at the historical site, leading school groups through the chamber, telling them Sarah Blackwood's story. She'd also become something of a quiet local celebrity, not because of the discovery itself, but because of how she'd responded to it. She'd become known as someone thoughtful and generous with her home and her time. The pool remained filled. She swam in it regularly. She also hosted the occasional evening gathering, not for performance but for simple pleasure. Neighbors came over. They swam. They sat afterward talking about ordinary things. One summer evening, Helen from the garden showed up with some of her unapproved decorations, statues and art pieces that Margaret had once deemed violations. She set them up around the pool area. "Hope you don't mind," Helen said to Miranda. "I wanted to reclaim them." "They're beautiful," Miranda said and meant it. Margaret arrived for the gathering and saw the decorations. She looked at them for a long moment, and Miranda watched her face go through a series of expressions. The old judgment, then the letting go of it, then something like appreciation. "They look great," Margaret said to Helen. "Really great. I'm sorry I made you take yours down." Helen smiled at her. It wasn't quite forgiveness, but it was grace. As the sun set, they sat by the pool. Miranda, Margaret, Helen, Danny, who'd become a friend, David and his son, who was now in art school, and several neighbors who'd simply wanted a pleasant evening out. Nobody talked about the chamber. Nobody talked about the discovery. They talked about gardens and jobs and kids and weather. They talked about ordinary things, the way people who shared a neighborhood should. Below the pool in the darkness, the chamber remained, sealed, preserved, telling its story to anyone willing to descend and listen. Above it, life continued. Imperfect, complicated, but real. People trying, people failing, people trying again. The pump ran quietly, maintaining the water, keeping the system alive. And the water reflected the stars, calm and clear and ordinary.